Hi everybody, it's Abra from Miss Z Photography again. So if you watched my previous video about the ISO, that is the first part, number one of 3 parts of the exposure triangle. And the exposure triangle are 3 different mechanisms that work together to achieve the perfect exposure, which is what your goal is when taking photography on a DSLR camera. So if you haven't watched the first video, go back and look for it. It's the ISO or the ISO. This video, we're going to talk about the second part, which actually has to do with your lens. And that is the shutter speed. And the shutter speed is how fast or slow your shutter opens and closes. So a fast shutter speed, in fact, you don't even hear it. It's all one click. And that stops motion, but it also allows less light into the camera. So it is a darker photo. But you can also freeze an image. If somebody is doing a backflip high up in the air and you have a really high shutter speed number, which in this case would be a fraction of a second, so say it's 1/500th of a second, which can also be known as just 500. So if your shutter speed is super high and you catch that person, it's going to look like they're suspended in the air. However, you will have to compensate in other ways to make sure that the photo is light enough. And that could be using the ISO or the ISO that we already talked about, or the aperture or f-stop that we'll talk about in the next video. Or it could even be using external flash, or it could be, if it's in the middle of the day, it could be super bright. So there's lots of different things. But with the shutter speed, it's how fast or slow your shutter on your lens opens and closes. So a higher number, so 1/500, even 1/250, that's still going to be like this, and you're just going to hear it snap. The lower you go, you start to get to 1/60 or 60, 1/30th of a second, it's going to slow down. And what that's going to do is it's going to allow more light into the camera, so it will be a brighter photo, but it will allow for blur and motion. Now, that's always not a bad thing. If you're taking a picture of a merry-go-round and the merry-go-round is going around at a constant speed and you take it, say, at 1/100th of a second or 100 or 1/25th of a second or 1/25, you will get it so that most of the main part, the little horse's head or animal's head, should be in focus, but you'll see a blur. So when you look at the picture, you know that it's on. However, if you take that same photo with a higher shutter speed, say 1/500th of a second or just 500, it will look completely stopped. You would actually think, someone looking at the photo would think you took a photo of the merry-go-round completely turned off. So in that case, a little blur would be good. Obviously, there's a lot of cases when blur is not good. So you need to balance for what you want your outcome to be, so that there's enough light, and there's either the blur that you want or there's no blur at all. So to reiterate, the shutter speed has to do with your lens itself and the shutter in your lens and how fast or slow the shutter opens and closes. So the higher the number, the faster it opens and closes, but the less light it lets in. So it's a darker photo. However, you're stopping motion. You're catching your things. If you have a toddler and you know how fast they run, you can actually catch them. And get their face at that kind of speed without it being all blurry like it might be with your phone. A lower, slower shutter speed, sometimes if you go so slow, you can actually hear the pause between it. You press the shutter speed and between it opening and closing. So the slower it is, the more light it lets in. So it's a lighter, brighter photo, but it allows more blur. And also depending, like if you're doing night photography, you will want to use a low exposure time, which is the same thing as shutter speed. It's just another, terminology for the same thing. And so at that point, you get to a point, usually anything under 160 really, or 1/60 or 60, though it's referred to as the same way, you usually can't really do without just hand holding, because just by hand holding it, your hands can't stay steady enough to keep from some motion blur. So at that point, you want to have a tripod so that it's down and it's solid and it's not moving. But again, shutter speed is how fast or how slow the shutter on your lens opens and closes. So a higher number, 1/500, which is also known as 500, it will be super fast. It will be a darker photo because less light is being let in. And then it will also be, it will stop motion. And then a slower number, say, 30, which is also known as 1/30 of a second, there will let some blur in, but it will let more light in, so it will be a lighter photo. So I hope that makes sense. You can always contact me with any questions. And this is the second video on the exposure triangle. Number 1 was about the ISO, which is how much light falls on the camera's sensor. And this one is the shutter speed or exposure time, which is how fast or slow your shutter on your lens opens and closes. So I will be back with another video, which will go over the aperture or the f-stop or depth of field. Again, there's many terms for the same thing in photography. So this is Abra from Miss Z Photography. Please check out my website at www.missszphotography.com. You can also find us on social media on Facebook at www.facebook.com/Miss and also on Instagram at instagram.com/MissZPhoto. And we love when you follow us and leave us likes and especially comments. So thank you for watching. Bye-bye now.